Reverend Sarah, thank you for agreeing to share your story. But before we start, how do you feel?
How do I feel? I'm wondering why I agreed to do this, actually. Before Christmas, I think it was before Christmas, because we'd originally planned to explore mental health in the context of discipleship after the incidents in Colombo of people committing suicide. And Ivor approached me and said, could we do something? He didn't know that in my past I had a period of a very deep depression. And I sort of came back to him and said, yes, he was thinking of a 2-part series. And I said, I will tell my story if you want. Which did seem something that God had laid on my heart. And I have probably told it twice over the last 20 years in this, looking at it from this particular perspective. But I am nervous because if I was telling you how I broke my ankle falling off a zip wire, that would be fine. That would be great fun. You'd probably think I was a bit foolish, but that would be great fun. When we start talking about mental health, people have a lot of perceptions, a lot of judgment, and a lot of things are put upon the person as they share that. And I am sharing it with you, but it will also go on the internet and all of those sorts of things. So I'm thinking, okay, there's the door. But we will share our conversation together, as I know we are here together, and all of us have a testimony of God journeying with us. And that's very important, that as a Christian community, we hear each other's gospel of what Jesus does in our lives.
Thank you. So I thought we'd start by asking you about what was your childhood like.
Okay, I grew up in a place called Nottingham. It is the proper place where Robin Hood came from. If any of you have any other ideas, they are wrong. It was Nottingham. My family is and was then very small. I am an only child of only children. Grandparents were alive at the time, back then, a long time ago. And my parents loved me unconditionally, and that I knew. Overwhelmingly, both my mother and father loved me, and I was never in any doubt of that. However, they had a very volatile relationship. They were either absolutely brilliant together, and ironically, they were often brilliant together when things were difficult, or they were disastrous. There was no middle ground, and so that was it wasn't like a fighting ground or anything, but there were fights, and that's why I say I am very aware though that each of them loved me. So it wasn't an unhappy childhood. It was quite normal. I went to the normal high schools in my locality. I was part of uniformed organisations. I played the tuba very badly. And yeah, that was my normal background.
So how did you become a Christian?
Yeah. How did I become a Christian? Well, I was a Sunday school teacher's nightmare. And my mother was a Christian. My father, I learnt later in life, actually, just before he died, had made a confession of faith in the Salvation Army, but I never knew that at the time, and he didn't come to church. And I went to church before I was born, and at about the age of 3, Jesus was my friend. And anybody who didn't think Jesus should be their friend, I have to be honest, I thought was a little silly. Because why wouldn't you want Jesus as your friend? So I was sort of evangelizing at 3. And later in life, I made what we would consider confession of faith and confirmation in my early teens. And sometimes I thought, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have had the Damascus experience, like Paul. But I was more a Peter, plodding on all the time. And my Sunday school teachers longed to get rid of me out of class because I used to answer the questions too much or ask more questions.
So logically we come to the point of asking, so have you always been depressed?
Okay, I come from the Northern Hemisphere, and it is not uncommon for people in the Northern Hemisphere to experience something called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. And it all relates to sunlight. And I was one of those people that in the winter my mood would go down. Not necessarily a depression, but it would drop and my energy would drop. And this isn't unique in the Northern Hemisphere. Some of you who have friends who live overseas in places like Britain and Scandinavia particularly may be familiar with it. I think the blessing of living here, as long as you get enough sunlight, helps with that.
So it's a D deficiency is what we call it, I think.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Reverend Sarah. So there was this, before 1978, people thought that depression was associated with personality, that people who were neurotic or extroverted were more prone to depression. But in 1978, there was a breakthrough research that was done by Brown and Harris. And what that research proved was that big life events like change. Sorry. Okay, the breakthrough research done in the UK, which changed the way people viewed depression, which is that social factors and stressful life events could contribute to depression, which was a big change. These events can be both negative and positive. So as you see on the slide, those are death of a spouse, financial challenges, issues at work, change in a relationship, having a child, divorce, exams and studying, buying a house, starting a new job. So Reverend Sarah, if you could tell us what that big event that contributed to your depression.
Okay, so I've mentioned my childhood growing up. I took my A-levels. I went off and trained as a nurse. Well, actually, I went to Bible college for a year. I forgot that. And then I trained as a nurse. And then in 1991, and pinpointed this particular time, an incredible number of things happened to me. One was I got married, and which is what we're saying. Life events aren't necessarily negative things. Getting married, though, you know, that first day where you've suddenly spent 24 hours with somebody and their toothpaste is all over the sink or whatever it might be, are things that you have to get used to and adapt to. So they are a big change. So I got married in 91. And then over the next 4 years, my husband and I experienced quite a number of very significant things. We lost his mother first. She passed away. And then my mother had a huge stroke. She was 65 years old. I was 25 when I got married, nearly 26. And this stroke took her right side, but it took her speech. And that was the significant thing. And I mentioned that my parents were volatile during my growing up, and they had actually separated at this point in time, and were in the process of going through a divorce. And I sometimes wonder if I am the only person in the world that has ever actually done this. I would like to know if there are other people. I had to take power of attorney for my mother, and actually for her mother, who was in her late 80s, and divorce my mother from my father, because my mother couldn't give instruction to the solicitor. Fortunately, Graham was around, and we had friends who were solicitors and helped us understand how to do this. But that had a huge impact in that it changed my relationship with my father, and obviously shifted things with my mother. We found ourselves moving house 3 times. My husband had just qualified as a psychologist and was about to start his work as an educational psychologist training. So we had moved closer to his family to try and have a network, because we wanted to have family. We also moved my mother and grandmother closer to us. I'd like to tell you about the hand of God in that, which was quite amazing, but that's not part of where our focus is tonight. And then in the summer of 1996, it became very apparent that my husband was ill. We didn't actually know what was his illness. It took the doctors 2 or 3 months. A few things were flying around, and it was discovered he had something called Wegener's granulomatosis, which is a breakdown in the blood vessels, autoimmune disease, and the blood vessels begin to bleed out. At that time, though, we weren't anticipating it to be as fatal as quickly as it was. We had been informed that with medication and chemo tablets, he would live probably another 10 years. So we weren't anticipating necessarily it being that fatal, though we had one instance where he did get very seriously ill, and we actually did say goodbye to each other because we realized that probably this illness was affecting him in a way that it wasn't the normal rhythm of things. And towards the end of 1996, he passed away. So they were a series of life events. And if you remember the sermon last week when we were looking at Elijah, there were a series of things that happened in Elijah's life. And so there was a cumulative number of things that had occurred in a very short time period.
Yeah. So did you become depressed after the death of your husband?
No. Now that might surprise you, but those signs of actual depression weren't there at the time. And I, as a nurse, we now call it palliative care. Back in the 90s, we were still calling it death and dying. And actually, not only did I practice in that area of nursing, I used to teach that to intensive care doctors of how to look after people at death and in their process of dying. So when Graham died, I actually did, in my mind, all the right things. I went to counselling, I took some time off work, and actually was just distraught, naturally and appropriately normal grief of being distraught at the loss of a spouse. So nothing extra at that time. And in fact, during Graham's illness, I had been very conscious. I'd had a call to the ministry, and it was after he died that I discussed that with my minister. And one would usually say, don't do anything rash before 2 or 3 years of a significant bereavement like that. The Methodist Church changed their training system, which meant that I did go into college to train as a minister, but I went in a year earlier than we had anticipated. So at that point, no, I wasn't depressed.
Interesting. Then when and how did you recognize that you were depressed?
Now, I don't want to put anybody off for training to be a minister, but it was in theological college. A few things happened, really. These are little incidents that contribute to a journey to depression. And what I want to share, or for you to understand, is these things don't always happen overnight. They do to some people, but often it is cumulative. And I had been in the laundry room, and I was talking to a person who is a good friend of mine now. In fact, she does my accounts for me. And as we got talking, doing our laundry, I realised, and so did she, that we got married on exactly the same day, in exactly the same year, and possibly at exactly the same time. And she was in college with her husband and her first child. And I felt I was looking at a parallel life. And that was very hard, because one of the things that I was very conscious of, and by now I was coming up to 35, was the question of children. And that was very significant to me. But even then, the summer was difficult. I'd done a year in college, and I realised that I wasn't as engaged. And then in the September, when the term restarted, we had a fellowship meal. And this good friend, Fiona, actually didn't tell me, I overheard it as we were all chatting, said she was pregnant a second time. And at that point, I literally ran out of the room, and I remember running out of the room because we had a very renowned theologian called, I forgot her name, isn't that awful? Monica Higgins, that's not actually her right name. I've forgotten. Morna Stacey. And Morna was standing there in her sort of place of honour, and I elbowed her out the way so I could get out the room. And that was the trigger. And I went back to my apartment in the college, and I ended up on the floor in the corner. And And I probably stayed there in that sense for a number of weeks. I was getting up and going to bed. But for me, it was just a trigger that broke me. And that's the only way I can describe it. It just broke me, and I couldn't hold anymore. And that pain. And that was the point that then, not really me saying I was depressed, but other people came round me. And college set up some counselling. I was seeing my GP. Nobody talked about a breakdown, and nobody talked about admitting me to hospital. But I saw my GP every fortnight before morning surgery. Now, I had to drive back to my home area, so this was the GP that had also gone through Graham's illness with me, so she knew what had gone on prior to this point. So yeah.
Do you want to have some water or something?
No,
Are you
all
okay?
right. Yeah, I had some when you were doing the slide.
Can you describe your depression?
My depression for me, and it's difficult for other people, and I've tried hard to think if I could remember it, it was really like a fog, because I still functioned. And I attended the routine of college. So we had morning prayers, we had various things that occurred during the college day. Initially, I wasn't going to lectures, but it was just like this fog, because I still had my mother and my grandmother to take care of. They were still alive, and they were living in warden-controlled facility. So I still had responsibilities towards them, so I still had to function. As I mentioned, there weren't any siblings to take over that duty. And it was in the early stages, it was a very physical thing. I literally would sit in a corner and make myself very small, as though hiding a very fecal position. The person I shared the apartments with, I know they used to go home to their family at weekends, were very worried. And I was in this college environment.
So what treatment did you take?
Okay, I've mentioned that I saw my GP. I've mentioned that I had counselling. I also took Prozac. Hands up, I am a great fan of Prozac. I confess that. Antidepressant drugs are not as they were in the 60s and 70s. And I think I was on Prozac for about 8 months. And during that time, I came out of the corner and began to re-engage in life. And I wasn't on it for a huge amount of time, but I also had medication, and I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who held me in prayer, who knew the wounds that I carried. I remember a good friend coming to me in college, almost petrified, going, "Morning prayers is Hannah tomorrow. I thought I'd warn you in advance." So I was in that sort of environment, which is as much treatment as the therapies and the medication and everything else.
So you had support. What was your spiritual life like?
Spiritual life, and that's why I picked the reading I did, was God hanging on to me. After Graham had died, in a normal place of grief, I had been using a book of prayers per day. And after he died, the only prayer I could read was Friday, which was the crucifixion. And when I was in my depression, I knew I loved a God who had cried out in distress, and that Jesus was holding me. And there weren't really words or prayers. I would go to college chapel, but certainly in the early days of my depression, as I say, it was all a bit of a fog, and putting words into that. And I believe very strongly, not just in times of illness, but if people have made a confession of faith and then they walk away, God never quite lets go. And I have seen people come back to the church years later, often when they've had children or when something's happened to them, because God has still kept a finger on their lives. And I knew I wasn't holding on to God. God was holding on to me.
And now, Reverend Sarah?
Now, well, I have to be very mindful. I mean, when I was coming out here, and when you come into the ministry and when you become a mission partner, you have a psychological assessment. And when I went for my last one, what the psychologist was saying was my depression is linked very closely to grief. And certainly when my mother died, I noticed that I was beginning to spin a little bit. So I made sure that I got to the doctor very quickly. I noticed the signs that I was possibly dipping. I also practiced something called Ignatius spirituality. And Ignatius spirituality, it's 12th century, it's very old, and it's exercises that talks about desolation and consolation. And if in our lives we find ourselves spinning out of control, a little bit like Elijah last week in the sermon, who kept going around the eye, that place of desolation, you learn to go back to, actually, where is the place I remember God being very present in my life, the place of consolation. And when my father passed away, I was aware that this was potentially something that could happen to me, and I put in a number of things, and I'm grateful that during that time I didn't slip into a depression. So it's about knowing myself, knowing what the triggers are and what the signs are. And for me, if I don't wash my hair for a week, there's usually something that's possibly not right, or it's just I'm just too lazy. But no, washing my hair is an interesting sign, and I was discussing this with a friend, and it's a similar thing for her. That self-care, healthy diets, being mindful of exercise, the green outdoors, and as you can see, that's me on the slide at Vacation Bible School. Coming down. Life carries on, still has its challenges, still has its joys, so it's...
So you have insight about your...
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would you tell others who are struggling with depression?
I think what I would say to other people is, you're not a failure. It's an illness. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a punishment in any way. Help is available. And to share with somebody you trust. Having people to talk to, get the help that you need, but just having somebody who will sit next to you, or a member of your family, or anybody you know, or if you are that person for somebody else to trust, that you just go and sit next to them. You cannot cure them. The cure will come to them in time, but you can sit next to them and be with them and be that person who will be trusted. And also some of the things that we've talked about on other occasions as well. Healthy diet, lots of greens, lots of exercise, social activities, rest, sleep, water, all those things that actually sound very basic, but they keep both our body and our minds healthy. And it has also been shown that singing, and for us as well as Christians, taking things to God and just knowing that if it occurs to anybody here or anybody in their family, they are ill. That is all. And I've put on the screen a picture of probably another of those very well-known characters, Winston Churchill, who also suffered from depression, and very badly for all of his life. And he would call it the black dog. And he would refer to his black dog being back. And I've, as mentioned, William Culpeper. It doesn't matter who you are, and you are a worthy and valued human being who has got ill.
Thank you.
There's a bit of me that thinks we are going to play a song, but I am going to ask, one of the reasons we chose to do this up here was that we could make it more of a conversation. I am going to ask, does anybody want to ask anything? No, that's fine. I just wanted to offer that opportunity because it's a big subject, and some of you may be very familiar with it. Some of you may be encountering it for the first or second time and exploring how we as Christians, created in the image of God, can get ill in many ways. The song that we are going to play is Graham's Kendrick's For This I Have Jesus. I actually think for this we have Jesus.